Hello everybody. Today we have an incredibly special episode to share with you. We're going to be taking a look at the Cosmi semi-automatic shotgun. Now, for those that have never heard of the Cosmi, you're really in for a treat today. For those who already know what the Cosmi is, I'm sure you're already aware you're in for a pretty fantastic time. Now, running briefly through the history so that we can get inside the mechanism on this thing. The Cosmi was designed by Rodolfo Cosmi. He started design on the gun in the early 1900s, and by 1926 he had a complete prototype. He passed away soon thereafter, and he had two of his family members, Americo and Marcelo, take over the company. They got the gun into its first batch of production, and the gun saw about 300 examples made before World War II broke out. The gun came back into production following World War II, and has remained in production with essentially no major changes to the design ever since then. A total of around 9,000 guns have been made to date, and the workshop in which they're made is still staffed by members of the Cosmi family. Now, stepping back into the time of Rodolfo, he was very interested in hunting shotguns in general. He had sort of cut his teeth on making double-barrel shotguns in an artisanal style for some of his friends, so he was aware of how shotguns worked. However, as the story goes, he was one of the first people in Italy to own an Auto 5, way back when the Auto 5 was brand new, and he was fascinated by not only the long recoil mechanism, but the advantages that an automatic shotgun gave in hunting over, like at this point, traditionally side-by-sides is really all that you'd hunted with prior to then in Europe. Rodolfo was so fascinated that he put to work trying to make what he felt would be the perfect combination of automatic shotgun, in terms of its functional and mechanical characteristics, but with the handling characteristics of a side-by-side shotgun. Much like these days back then, it was seen that double barrels, be they side-by-sides or over-unders, offered superior handling characteristics in terms of the balance of the gun, was just sort of preferred by people then. Much like these days, you see a lot of more serious competitors opting for, over-unders is sort of in vogue now, but typically shotguns with two barrels are preferred for those specific handling characteristics. Of course, many competitions and such these days prohibit the use of automatics, but that's a whole separate conversation for another time. The long and short of it is he wanted to combine the Auto 5 with the handling characteristics of a double-barrel shotgun. And in his namesake automatic shotgun, I think Rodolfo did nothing short of miracle working. Once we crack this thing open, you'll see the mechanism on the inside. It's incredibly impressive, and it's amazing that he came up with this, again, back in the 1920s, is shockingly early to be putting together something that is, I'm not going to say a hands-down improvement to the Auto 5, but a shockingly competent reimagining of the Auto 5, really from the top to the bottom. This, of course, gets us into a discussion on the actual handling of the thing. Now, those who are familiar with the Cosmi know its most interesting trick is the fact that it may be a long recoil semi-auto gun, but it's got a brake lever. And that's because it's got hinged receivers, right? The receiver hinges open like so. This is to facilitate loading of the gun as well as maintenance of the thing in the first place. Now, you may look at this and go, why? Why on earth would that ever be, why would anybody ever want to do that? Well, the answer is really twofold. One big complaint against the Auto 5 when it came out, that was something that ultimately people just ended up accepting with automatic shotguns, was the inclusion of a charging handle. A charging handle just became a snag point on the gun. So especially if you're wetland hunting or you're hunting in a blind or you're hunting in tall grass or something, the charging handle will catch on stuff, and if you try and snap the gun up to your shoulder from your hip and drag the charging handle through grass the whole way, there is a lot of excess drag there. The charging handle was seen as being ugly as far as artisanal shotgun manufacture anyway. They sort of felt the charging handle was ugly, they felt it was a snag point and a liability. So one of the things that Rodolfo wanted to do was eliminate, right? Have the charging handle shaved off, and having the action break open is the way to facilitate not having a charging handle. Of course, we'll break the action open, and we'll see on the bottom of the bolt there's this spoon. If we pull up on this spoon here, we can retract the bolt. The bolt will lock in the rearward position, and this is what facilitates loading the first shell into the gun. At this point, we could shove one shell into there, and then push the bolt forward, and it snaps back into place, locking into the barrel extension. Now, another thing that Cosmi felt was wrong about the Auto 5 was the way that it balanced. A somewhat typical complaint, especially from Europe, against automatic shotguns or pump-action shotguns or anything that had a mag tube out underneath the barrel is that the weight of the gun and the balance and swing of the gun would be different when the gun is loaded versus empty. And this can be disconcerting for a number of reasons. I don't know how much I really agree with this. I guess the one caveat is I will agree with this in the case of like those 8-shot extended foreends for Auto 5s. At that point, they do swing very differently. It's perceptibly different whenever it's loaded versus empty. With 5 shots, I don't know that it makes a big difference, but Cosmi went out of his way to think about a way to fix this, and his solution is pretty simple. Why don't we just put the magazine in the buttstock? So you have a magazine that runs down into the wrist of the stock, and loading is facilitated by pushing shells backwards into the action. And of course we'll demonstrate that and show that off during our shooting section, but there is your follower at the front of the magazine entrance, and rounds go backwards into the gun. Because the magazine is there sort of where you'd normally have the hammer to strike a firing pin, we'll see that the firing pin on the bolt right there is offset to the side, as is the hammer. We'll get a closer look at this mechanism once it's taken apart, but the thing to see here is that the hammer is right there on the side of the action. Now, not dissimilar to the double barrel shotguns of the day, right? Those were mostly external hammer double barrels. I mean, not exclusively, but there were a lot of external hammer double barrel shotguns that were familiar to the Italians for hunting, really familiar to the world for hunting at that point. So what Cosmi wanted to do is sort of maintain that manual of arms and having a hammer that, once the gun is cracked open, can be manually cocked. These days people look at that and go, well, that's stupid. Why on earth would you want that? You know, why wouldn't they make it so that the hammer auto-cocks whenever you crack the action open? And that's valid using the lens that we have today. However, the Cosmis Cosmis are in production today still, right? We've mentioned that. The reason they wouldn't change that is because it's always been done this way, and at this point it's sort of a staple of the design. The reason it was done that way in the first place is that's what people were used to. People weren't really used to doing it right the other way, right? The modern way, breaking open the gun, cock the hammer, wasn't something that most people were accustomed to. Most people were accustomed to having to pull the hammer back manually on their own. And so that manual of arms was incorporated into an automatic so that there's not this sort of weird disconnect. As you move from a side-by-side to something like this, it sort of fixes that problem, which is a really, really interesting way to have, it's like an interesting perspective, right, to look back on is they wanted you to have to cock the hammer because people were used to having to cock the hammer because external hammer shotguns was normal at this point in time. Now, finishing up our discussion on our external controls, we do have a safety located back here on the tang. On all of the Cosmis I've handled, this safety has been stiff, almost as though it wasn't used a lot. And whenever the action is latched shut, it sort of prevents you from being able to easily put the safety on. I reckon this safety was just sort of put there as a regulation or a peace of mind thing so that once you broke the gun open, if you wanted to throw the thing on safe, you could, so that either the gun's safe to work on or if you needed to mess with it or take the gun apart, you wouldn't have to worry about it. But otherwise, that safety isn't really doing a whole lot there. Now, before we tear into the mechanism internals of the gun, there's two common criticisms of the Cosmi that I want to address. The first is entirely valid, and it's that new Cosmis cost about 25 grand and upwards from there if you want engraving or fancier wood or things like that. They're really, really expensive guns. You can find them used quite a bit cheaper. This was a used example that I bought. I ended up having to put the recoil pad on it, not for recoil reduction, but to give me a little bit more length of pull, because whoever had this stock made for them was a little bit shorter than I, and I needed about an extra 1.5 inches to get the gun very comfortable for me. So for most people, it really comes down to the used market. And you can find these things on Gunbroker, the usual places. Rock Island auctions them, Gunbroker auctions them. You can find used Cosmis, and usually at a pretty decent price. I'm going to cut to a little bit of the chase in the conclusion when I say, and I can say this with a straight face, I think the Cosmi is worth a great deal of money. How much it's actually worth to you specifically will depend on a large series of questions and how much value you attribute to certain things like fit and finish and panache and the gun being mechanically interesting as it is. However, in my opinion, a standard grade Cosmi, sort of something like this, easily worth $10,000 just because of the fit and finish and the mechanical intricacy and just how neat the thing is. However, for some people, all of those things might not matter to them, and what really matters is it's got a gun that goes bang when you pull the trigger. And in that case, an Auto 5 does most of the same things, right? It also goes bang when you pull the trigger. This sort of gets us to the complaint number 2 levied against the Cosmi. If a Cosmi jams, clearing the jam can be a little bit of a head scratcher because the manual of arms is so different. Say you have a failure to fire or a failure to feed, it sort of involves a process where In the case of a failure to fire, you break the action open, you can recock the hammer, then shut the action, then try and pull the trigger again to see if it goes in a second strike, but that's a little awkward. Say that you just wanted to get that shell out of there, you break the action open, you recock the hammer, you pull back the bolt to eject that previous shell, then you have to take one shell manually from the magazine, put it in the chamber, close the bolt, shut the gun, and then you're ready to try and fire again. That is a whole load of steps in order to remedy something that, if you have a charging handle, you just go ka-chunk, ka-chunk, and it's done. So that is certainly a legitimate criticism of the Cosmi, is that clearing jams on the thing is tricky. Now, at this point, I have fired 6 different Cosmis. I've only ever experienced one failure with a Cosmi, and that was due to using a load that was incompatible with the way the recoil system was set up. So, barring that, they are incredibly well-made, incredibly reliable guns. So it's trying to cut on that, there's a razor, right, that cuts 2 ways. It's a gun needs to be easy to have jams cleared, or a gun just needs to never jam. And a gun needs to be built assuming that it will never jam, and that if it jams, it needs to be rare enough that the inconvenience of clearing the jam isn't so bad. This is sort of the design philosophy that with the AR-15, for example, most people accept. Clearing more severe jams in the AR-15 is really, really difficult compared to something like the M1 Garand. The Garand with its open top receiver, it's very easy to diagnose and clear something like a failure to extract or a stuck case or things like that. Much easier to remedy than on an AR-15. Of course, then the trade-off is the Garand has stuff get into it and it's much easier for it to jam, and external factors can jam it much easier than the AR-15, which is pretty sealed off. The same way here, you have a much more sealed off system that is doing its best to resist jamming, not only in the quality of which it is built, but the way the entire system is sealed up and sort of resistant to ingress. You sort of got that same sort of competing factor. So yes, clearing something like a failure to fire or a failure to feed can be a little bit awkward with the Cosmi. However, it's awkward for a reason, right? There's competing factors involved with getting rid of the charging handle entirely. In a future video, we may be able to take a look at what if the Cosmi did have a charging handle. We'll be able to explore those sorts of thoughts later on down the road. But for now, that's why the Cosmi is configured the way it is. It was designed in an antiquated time, and it was designed in such a way that even by modern standards, certainly, its manual of arms is all sorts of wonky. But the gun is extremely reliable, and the gun is extremely well built, and there isn't a whole lot of maintenance or reliability problems that you're going to run into with the thing. Really just coming down to assuming you got the recoil spring system set up right, which we're going to get into now as we start taking the gun apart. Taking the thing apart is pretty familiar to double gun people, as well as also to Auto 5 people. We have a screw out here at the end of a handguard that levers off, sort of like on a double gun, only the screw has to be undone like it's an Auto 5. So we come out here to this screw, which is also a sling swivel. I'll actually flip the gun like so we can try and avoid dinging it up too much. And we spin this sling loop off. And the sling loop does have a detent to it. That's why it goes click, 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 click. And the way the sling loop is designed is that when it's fully tightened, the sling loop is it's clocked, so the detents on it are machined after the threads are fit together. Because like most things on this gun, it's all just hilariously well made, right? Like, if there's a way that they could have made it more complicated, they just went ahead and did that. All right, so with that screw loosened, the forend slides off, like on a double barrel. It doesn't have to slide all the way off. Because an incredible mechanical feat was pulled off in the Cosmi, there isn't structural wood. This wood is not a part of holding the barrel on the gun. You could shoot the gun like this, no forend on the gun whatsoever. It's kind of funny, if not funny, miraculous, that in 1926, Rodolfo Cosmi figured out a way to fix the biggest problem with the Auto 5, which is its use of structural wood. Even things like the Remington 1148 that put steel reinforcement in the handguard didn't get away from the use of structural wood. It still does need that to hold the gun together. So this is kind of amazing. Now the way that's pulled off is, of course, our screw out here with the detent is just a screw. We have our rear iron, which has this sort of round shape that rides around the lower receiver. So as this rear iron is held between the upper and lower receiver, as the thing pivots and hinges, the screw at the front holds it on there, and otherwise this is really just a cover to keep you from getting your hands pinched underneath the barrel spring in the reciprocating barrel. So that's a really impressive way for this to be designed. We will set that to the side for now. And for the reason I just explained, right, this is an incredibly trim piece of wood. It's very thin, and of course steel reinforced at the back to sort of prevent cracks there. But up here, that's almost exquisitely thin, and it gets to get away with this because this is no longer a structural piece, right? You don't have the barrel beating forward trying to beat the handguard off the gun because you have this mechanism going on here. And really what this is similar to the Browning double auto. We have a steel rod that comes all the way to the front, which is threaded for our end cap. This is like a Auto 5's regular end cap right out here on the end of this rod. This is what's holding the barrel on the gun. However, another difference from the Auto 5, as we'll see in one moment, there's actually a buffer spring at the front of this assembly. So as the barrel's rocketing forward, instead of it bottoming out on wood like we have on the Auto 5, it bottoms out against a spring that sort of cushions it as it beats against, the steel to steel to steel contact, which isn't something that you get with the Auto 5, right? In the Auto 5, you have steel to wood to steel. And that wood being in the middle of the Auto 5 sort of stack up there causes trouble. Anyway, our next step in taking the Cosmi apart will be to hinge the receivers apart. This will be very familiar to anybody who's a double gun person, but we just hinge the receivers, and it will push the lower off the upper with that little ramp there sort of designed to help push them apart. And we now have our receivers separated. Upper receiver has all of the sort of barrel and bolt operating mechanics. Lower receiver has all of your guts. It's kind of cool because you have some guns from Winchester that have sort of figured out the upper-lower receiver split by this point in time, but at least when it comes to shotguns, that's not something you see a lot of. I guess we've got it in the Winchester 1911, and it's possible that Cosmi got the idea for having the upper and lower receiver separate the way they do, right? How do you make the split between them? Well, the Winchester 1911 sort of had that with its takedown mechanism where you have most of the lower guts of the gun go one way and most of the upper guts of the gun go the other way. But the way the Cosmi pulls it off is confidence inspiring. It's really cool to see it pulled off this way. Now, to continue taking the Cosmi apart further than this, we do need the help of a tool. The end cap here is knurled, and you can get it to move at the sake of all of your fingertips as you grind it off. Because of the way the buffer spring and the barrel rest against this nut, it is very hard to move it. The Cosmi comes with a disassembly tool to take this apart, but as I bought this gun used, it did not come with that tool, and so we're going to just use an Allen wrench that we stick in the flats here, and that is a good tight fit. We won't booger anything up, but essentially the way that the tool works is it's just a handle on something that's shaped like an Allen wrench anyway, so we'll end up making do with what we have. And what we need to do is spin this nut forward off of the barrel. And it is possible to idiot scratch your Cosmi while you do this, so I'll have to hold it at an angle to avoid that. Because the way that this nut is offset, if you have your tool sticking too far out into it, you can scratch the barrel on the gun. And some used Cosmis you'll see just have a little scratch there on the barrel. Not that that hurts anything, it's just that it's a sign that your gun was taken apart and cleaned, I guess, really is what it is. So that's not a bad thing, ultimately. But we'll go ahead and get this nut spun off. And at a certain point, it does become something that you can spin by hand. And as you do this, the barrel will be coming forward. I guess at any point that you want, you can lock the bolt back because the barrel will come out and then the bolt will come out after it. Once we are done removing this nut. And it does have plenty of threads on it because in the fashion of this gun, everything is just a little bit overbuilt. But there is the nut. And all that's doing really is holding on our buffer spring here, which is this chunky flat wire spring that the barrel beats forward against. But then once that's out of the way, the barrel will slide off and out of the upper receiver. And this is our Cosmi barrel. You can see not all of them have this. It was an option to have weight reduction cuts done on the barrel extension because it doesn't need all of that steel. And instead of cutting windows all the way through it, which could cause structural problems, it's really just weight reduced cuts with a ball nose end mill all over the stinking thing. Otherwise, we have a barrel extension that's a lot like the Auto 5s, right? We've got our barrel extension with our barrel clocked into it. We have our extractor there mounted on it. Unique to this Cosmi is it's a shorter barrel than sort of typically seen, and it doesn't have a rib. The rib is standard on Cosmis, and having this sight was non-standard, and that sort of spoke to me that somebody opted not to have a rib on their Cosmi. And then once I got the things in my hand, I sort of understood it because the gun just fits me so well and it does point rather nicely. And sort of the advantage of not having a rib is if you're going to take the thing hunting, which is my ultimate goal with this thing, you don't have to worry about the rib getting beat up or dinged or knocked or hurt in any sort of way. which even though this is a used Cosmi, just sort of picking a Cosmi up, you feel a responsibility to treat it nicely, right? Try not to ding it up as much as you can, if that makes any sense. I guess sort of another thing that's interesting and unique to this barrel is the barrel hanger is silver soldered on as opposed to being forged integral. You can find Cosmi barrels made both ways. Cosmi barrels made earlier to this one in serial number sequence would have it forged integral, so I'm not sure why this one is brazed on. However, it is serial number matched on the base to the barrel to the extension, so I'm quite confident that this is the way that the gun came from the factory. And the size of the base that they put on there, there's a lot of material holding it on there underneath that solder joint. I'm not worried about this going anywhere. It's not like the little footprint that you'll see on some guns that have a chance of cracking off. This is a pretty substantial amount of material that should hold it on there for a long time, and if it breaks off, then I guess I'm getting it soldered on. But that's it really for the Cosmi barrel here. Nothing too extreme going on with this one. It's just short. Got the sort of rifle style sight. We've sort of seen the same similar thing on the Winchester Model 40, and I didn't like it at all on the Winchester Model 40. But for whatever reason, the way the Cosmi just fits me differently, I do like it a lot here. So it's sort of a difference in how the gun fit, I guess, can affect how you prefer your sights to be, which should kind of be a no-brainer. But that's pretty much it for the Cosmi barrel. We can set that. Of course, we'll set that further than the lower receiver because we're going to need to get back into that lower receiver here in a second. Now, the recoil system on the Cosmi is inspired by the Auto 5, right? We have a friction brake system. We have that brass friction brake. We have our control ring that's on it. However, flipping the control ring around is not what sets sort of the weight or the effectiveness on the system of the Cosmi. The manual for the gun is quite explicit that the friction brake is always to be set up with the heavy load equivalent, right? You're not supposed to take the control ring and flip it around. It's always supposed to be set this way. The way that the gun is calibrated for different loads is by using springs of different weights. For 12 gauge guns, there's 3 different spring loads, and they sort of divide them based on the dram weight, really the power of the round that you're shooting. For 20 gauge guns, for modern production, there's 2 springs. Evidently, at one time in the past, there were 3 springs for 20 gauge guns. Probably they just dropped one that was for extra light loads, because 20 gauge used to be loaded really, really light, and finding those ultralight 20 gauge loads these days is pretty difficult. So I imagine they dropped the one off the bottom end, though that is just my guess. As far as these springs are concerned, Nighthawk, the 1911 manufacturer, is the current importer of new production Cosmis, and they will sell you extra springs if you email them. They are available. So as far as you wearing out springs, right, that's something that I've seen people postulate with Cosmis is, well, if I get one and I shoot it, won't I wear it out? Won't it get broken? My analysis and my opinion of that is you're not going to break the steel parts of this gun because they are all really, really well made. Most of the steel parts in this gun do have complex shapes, but they're all sort of unitized, right? This gun was designed in the 20s when they didn't really have heavy manufacturing, especially not in Italy. So most of the pieces of this gun, while they've got complex shapes on them, would not be very difficult for a gunsmith today to make new if they had to. And as far as finding springs and bits, right, really that's the last difficult part. Because the gun is still in production, Nighthawk is able to get you replacement parts for Cosmis from Cosmi directly, such as new springs if you wear out springs. So it really is a thing where, as rare and as valuable as these guns can be, you can kind of shoot them without feeling guilt or without having to have that. I've always got that anxious worry when I'm shooting something like the AR-17, where I know every time I fire it, I'm getting one round closer to a part in the gun breaking that's going to be really uncool to have to remake. Whereas in the case of the Cosmi, you can get replacement, like if you break an extractor, you can get replacement extractors. So replacement parts for the gun are not impossible to find because Nighthawk imports the parts and because Cosmi is still around and still making guns. But to get this recoil assembly off, just because I'd like to show you guys the parts, the split in the friction ring itself actually lines up with a tooth that's on this rod. That's what sort of holds it in this sub-assembly position. And the best way to get this assembly off is to cover it with a rag and have it pointed downwards because the barrel springs on Cosmis are pretty darn stiff compared to Auto 5s. So what we'll do here is rotate this, I guess just so the camera can see that a little better. You can see there's a split there and there's a peg there, and we're just going to rotate it this way until everything pops off while pointing it down. There we go. On this particular gun, I have rocketed parts once. It will throw this friction ring and this control ring, good 20, 30 feet with as stiff as this spring is. But there's that. At this point, the spring will rotate off, and then the last couple turns of the spring have to be turned to get it past that little peg. Just to show you guys, it's just a little triangle that I'm not sure if they weld on and then grind or it's just machined that way, but you sort of got your reciprocating rod, the part the barrel reciprocates on there. It's held into the barrel by the sort of threaded nut that also acts as a base for the recoil spring to push against. But that really is all there is to it, to the Cosmi's recoil system. Now, the last part to look at here in our upper is going to be our bolt, and then I suppose the upper itself. A little bit of excess grease. I have been shooting this thing a lot, so it is a little dirty. Apologize for dirty fingers you'll have to be seeing. So inside of the upper here, of course, you've got your bolt and your barrel reciprocating. Kind of unique to the Cosmi is that the bolt group getting unlocked from the barrel is not accomplished whenever the bolt group gets hooked onto the carrier dog. Right? The carrier dog locks into this notch, and this notch doesn't unlock the bolt group at all. Instead, the way that that unlocking is accomplished is a wedge back here in the top of the upper. So as the bolt and barrel are coming backwards together, again, slightly similar to the double auto, but only insofar as the barrel starts going forward before the bolt has completely finished going backwards, the bolt will be driven out of lock by this surface here on the bolt, getting driven down by this wedge that's in place in the back of the upper. So as the bolt is coming back, right, imagine the bolt and barrel are locked together here. So with our bolt and barrel locked backwards together, as these are sliding back through the receiver, that wedge in the receiver is going to push on this wedge here on the bolt group, which lowers the locking shutter down. As the locking shutter comes down, and of course we can also just pull on the spoon, also lowers that locking shutter. So you can imagine it comes back, pushes into that wedge, and that lowers the shutter. That's before this whole assembly has bottomed out against the back of the receiver. So as this is slowed down almost to a halt at the back, the barrel is able to get pushed forward by the spring as the bolt is bottoming out against the back of the receiver. Because of this, the impact of the whole reciprocating assembly hitting the back of the receiver is attenuated slightly. I'm not going to say the Cosmi is incapable of bottoming out hard. However, the barrel is going to be being pushed forward by the heavy barrel spring before it has, with its full energy, smacked into the back of the receiver. So it's going to have an extra braking effect, if you will, that's just on it and not also on the bolt, as the bolt's driven to the back of the receiver and that lock is cammed down so that the bolt can disengage from the barrel. This is unique compared to something like the Auto 5 or a lot of the other shotguns we've looked at, where it's actually the bolt group after everything has slammed to the back, and then it's coming forward that the bolt group gets caught on the carrier dog, and the carrier dog then pulls the charging handle equivalent backwards, and that lets everything then unlock. Not how things work with the Cosmi, and that's kind of for the better here. Is this over-engineered? Maybe a little bit, but it's all in the effort to give you a smoother recoil impulse. And we'll talk more about the recoil impulse of the Cosmi in the shooting section. Spoiler alert, it's maybe not quite as smooth as you can get out of an Auto 5, but there's reasons for that that we'll elaborate on later. Now, looking closer at the bolt group, we have a series of holes that are just there for weight reduction. A great big slot for weight reduction, and just random holes punched in the back of the thing for weight reduction. I don't know that these were truly random. I imagine they probably did have a jig so that this could be done somewhat consistently, but they were trying to suck as much weight out of this gun as possible. And thanks to the way the gun balances, what with having less weight out front and then as much weight sucked out of the parts as it possibly can, the gun does balance and point and swing impeccably well. The incredibly trim forend is reminiscent of a side-by-side shotgun, and we'll talk more in the shooting section about just how nice the gun ends up feeling to hold in your hands and swing around and have fun with. But to avoid getting too far ahead of ourselves now, we can take the bolt group a little bit further apart. We have a Winchester 1911 inspired takedown there. Oh, and guess what? Lightning cuts, drilled holes for lightning, drilled hole for lightning. They wanted weight out of this stinking gun as much as they could get it. And with the lock removed, we can then remove the firing pin, which you can see there. It is certainly very dirty, but it's a relatively regular shape, and again, much stiffer and thicker than we've seen on pretty much any other firing pin we've looked at. It's very well overbuilt. And I'm not going to say that the reason they did this is because they didn't want to have firing pins wearing out, but certainly with a gun that's got an angled firing pin, the overall length dimension becomes much more important to prevent binding, or, of course, overextension now means that it's pushing primers and pushing shells off the side of the bolt face and into the extractor, so lengths and dimensions are a little bit more important here than on a regular firing pin, and as a result, you've got a very beefy, very important feeling firing pin. The plungers and springs in the bolt group are all retained by screws, so we have one little screw there, and that screw is the firing pin return spring. We have one screw with a spring here. That's the spring that springs the lock up and down. Of course, the lock needs to be sprung here as opposed to an Auto 5 because we have to be able to push the bolt backwards and forwards and have it lock into the barrel extension as you load the gun, right? You pull the bolt back, plunk one in the chamber, then push the bolt forward. The bolt lock has to be sprung for that, whereas in Auto 5 you don't do any of that nonsense, and the spring comes from the carrier tail. We don't have that going on here, so it has to be sprung separately. I'm not going to remove it here just because it's a little bit of a pain to put back in place, but through one of these lightning holes you have that, the spring mechanism that makes it so that the spoon sort of clicks into place there and then clicks back into place there. You can push the spoon out by pushing on this dowel, and then the spoon goes towards the middle and comes out of the bolt, but then so does its spring mechanism. Its spring mechanism wants to come out at that point anyway, so we're going to avoid having to deal with those parts. But besides that, the bolt group just comes down to a double extractor system, like on the Auto 5. Our primary extractor is incredibly stiff. Our secondary extractor is pretty light, like on an Auto 5. And the left side extractor comes out with its pin integral to it, so that pin comes out and then the whole extractor comes up with it. The right side, the primary extractor, just has a solid pin that runs straight up through the middle of it, and then they both have their plunger detents behind them. We're not going to take the extractors out just because I don't want to deal with fighting those plunger extractors, but that's all there is to the Cosmi bolt group. It's really quite simple, and it's not terribly hard to field strip, right? You'll note no taper pins. In 1926, they got a toolless disassembly for the bolt group. That's really, I mean, okay, I guess if you count spinning off that nut, which you could do with your hands, it's just kind of painful because it's so hard. Maybe there's like half of a tool needed. But the bolt grip itself, once it's in your hands, you can take it all the way apart without any tools, and that's really pretty impressive. I suppose if you wanted to maintenance these springs, you would then need a screwdriver, right? And if you wanted to get the spoon out, you're going to need some sort of a tool to reset the spring mechanism for it so you can get it back in place. But usually what we look for in that disassembly, right, like with the Remington 1148, is you can just sort of shake the bolt apart effectively, right? Just with your hands, you can get the lock out of it and the firing pin out of it for if you need to service those items. So you do have that here. And better than the Remington 1148, we don't have to sit there and fight it for 15 minutes in order to get the firing pin back into the gun. It just sort of takes its place. And then we can take our bolt lock, wiggle it back in, and then we have a reassembled Cosmi bolt. With the bolt group reassembled and discussed, we can set the whole upper to the side here because we're done dealing with it for now. In fact, really we could just reassemble it at this point, but we'll save all of reassembly for the reassembly portion. Oh, one thing I forgot to show you guys is the recoil spring assembly. You've really just got your friction piece and control ring, which sit together. The friction piece, gets clamped down onto that steel tube. Of course, you can oil it or grease it to reduce friction. The Cosmi manual specifically calls for the use of motor oil if you are to lubricate the friction system as opposed to grease or some other kind of oil. But of course, I've seen people use all sorts of different things, and you can, like on an Auto 5, right, you're not going to break it if you use the wrong kind of oil. You just may have to reapply it more often or do all sorts of things. Cosmi recommends motor oil. Motor oil is the gun oil that I usually use, right? If I'm not using general purpose grease or red and tacky grease, I'm going to be using motor oil, and that's just sort of the way that goes. But see, I was right all along about using motor oil for guns. Cosmi even says so. If you think I'm wrong, you think they're wrong, and I think they know more than you. Anyway, silliness aside, we now have our lower receiver group. This is the mechanism that captivates people's minds the most about this gun, sort of drives them crazy, is all of the guts going on in there. People look at that and go, how on earth could you ever even take that out of the gun? Would you believe me if I said it's no screws, no tools, it's just push one button and it all comes out of there? I'll show you that trick here in a second. One thing I want to discuss before that is that the stocks on Cosmis usually come off with a screw through the butt plate. Of course, because I've added my length of pull enhancer, that's going to be difficult, and I'm not lacing that back off of there. Additionally, the stocks on Cosmis are notoriously fragile. On the gun, there's not really a big risk of them breaking, but during removal and reinstall, it's possible to crack them if you're not paying attention to what you're doing. And so because of that, I've had the stock off this gun once before just to say I had it, and to put a little bit of grease on the steel parts underneath there, a little bit of oil on the steel parts underneath there to keep them from rusting or having any sort of trouble. But getting the stock on and off of a Cosmi is very difficult. It's really just a process where you remove that stock bolt and then pull on the stock. With guns that haven't had their stocks off a lot, the trigger guard, which is a big long piece of steel which is threaded in there and then dovetails into the stock there, you'll be pulling and flexing the trigger guard and the whole thing will make you think you're about to break your gun in half. And then if you pull too hard and then at a wrong angle, you can crack your stock. So the whole thing is just very heart-wrenching. We're going to avoid doing any of that here today in this video because I like the stock being in one piece, the way that it is, with this nice shiny oil finish on it and not broken. Anyway, that discussion aside, we will now turn our attention to getting the guts out of the gun. So there is a bolt release on this gun. I should have mentioned earlier, On the last round fired, you don't have to break the gun open and then load it the same way. On the last round fired, the bolt will hold back, and you can just drop one round into the action and push this button, and it will automatically chamber it. So you do have that option. So it does work sort of regular to an auto 5 in that one way where, you know, one round at a time after the bolt is locked back, you can just push that button to go ahead and send the bolt home. What this button really accomplishes is like the side button on an auto 5, where really what it's doing is holding our carrier, our elevator, our shell lifter down. If we push this out of the way, the shell lifter can come up, and that's how the regular cycle of feeding, of course, works. Nothing there is new or unique to us. That's just how an auto 5 works, right? When the bolt is locked back against the carrier dog will be in its reclined position, right? It'll be pushed back there by the bolt, which it has captured. Right? That hook there on the carrier dog will be captured against that notch there on the bolt. So that's pushed downwards. As the barrel comes back forward, the barrel will push this door out of the way. It's that rounded cut there on the barrel that will push into this door to push it aside. Once it's pushed aside, because the carrier dog is now reclined, the carrier can pop up, like so. And then with the carrier popped up, the latch will be released from the bolt, and then the bolt can come forward, push the carrier down, and push the shell out of the way, and then feed it. This is just like an auto 5. So that part, this whole side of this mechanism that you're seeing there, just like an auto 5, there's nothing unique or special about it. This whole set of gubbins here, we can pull the trigger. The trigger is sort of a transfer bar mechanism. The trigger reaches up into here, and then the trigger interacts with this, which is your sort of multi-sear. You have opposing hooks here on the hammer. You've got a primary sear and then a secondary sear. The secondary sear is just sort of sprung there on the back side of the primary sear. The hammer comes down, clicks under that, trigger release, puts the hammer back on the primary sear. We've seen fire control groups more complicated than this and several other shotguns that nobody gawks at, right? So this really isn't that complicated. I guess the fact that it's offset to one side of the gun is unique, but in terms of what these pieces are each doing there in the fire control group, we've seen all that sort of thing before, so it's really nothing to worry about. But now we're going to set the hammer down and then get this mechanism out of the gun so we can see it a little better. The way to do this is to push this button so that the carrier can come up, put one finger back down into the magazine tube, and just sort of lift up. And then the mechanism will pop out just like so. Setting our magazine spring and follower to the side, of course it wants to come out of there as we're going. We sort of have the core gubbins of the gun, and then our lower receiver, which at this point isn't really doing a lot because the whole belly pan, right, this whole group comes out of there, and that's most of the gun at that point. Now, back down, hidden inside here in the lower receiver is a regular shotgun latch mechanism, right? And in fact, we can even just take our little tool here and then push downwards onto a plate and reset the latch like you would in any other sort of over-under shotgun, right? So this is all very familiar to those sorts of things. Go and snap that back over now, though. Besides that, we have a T-slot, and that slot is for this device to ride inside of. This device is really just like the carrier tail that we're used to seeing from an auto 5. So it will push here on the rear end of the bolt group to give the bolt its bolt spring. It then rides inside of this track on the internal gubbins mechanism, and then its tail pushes down onto a spring there, which goes down an action spring tube on top of the magazine tube. Really just like an auto 5, except for the magazine tube being in the stock. Finally, we have our trigger there, and you can see its arm wiggling on the side of the receiver. And all that does is interact with this sear mechanism here. The trigger arm sits inside of there, goes back and forth. And really, that's all there is to it, right? That's the trigger mechanism right there. Wow, look how complicated that is. It's a hammer that has a spring on it and a trigger mechanism that goes up and down. It's really actually not that complicated. The hammer spring is accessed through that hole there. It's a great big spring that comes through here and then pushes on a foot on the hammer. That's sort of where that gets its spring power from. You can see some of that from underneath there if the camera's focusing. If not, it's really nothing groundbreaking. It's just a spring pushing on a base of the hammer. We've seen that sort of thing before. Not dissimilar really to the Auto 5's flat spring, only this is a coil spring. The trigger group and its mechanisms are held in with these pair of screws here. Right? You can undo those screws, that plate comes off, all these guts come out there. And then on the other side of the gun, we've just got a carrier lifter assembly just like on an Auto 5. We've got a little V flat spring underneath it, powering it. Right, that will push it up, so it's an over-center thing. You've got a very sharp tooth governing the over-center mechanism, right? So that is very stiff compared to something like an Auto 5 or like the double auto, right? It basically just wants to bounce back and forth on its own. This one wants to be in one position or the other, and there's no ifs, ands, or buts really about that. We've got our carrier dog done just like the Auto 5's carrier dog, really. It's got a pin that you could punch out if you need to get to the spring in there or replace it. This whole mechanism rides on this boss. It's integral to the center gubbinsonator. And besides that, it's really just this whole central gubbin thing and its lightning holes that it's completely covered in. Right? You've even got extra lightning holes punched in the carrier. Again, trying to draw as much weight out of this lightning cut, much weight drawn out as it possibly can have. But that really is the internal mechanism. It's not hard to comprehend once it's out of the gun. Like in the gun, I agree. Very intimidating looking. Doesn't seem like mankind is meant to understand it. Outside of the gun, this is just like an Auto 5. We've seen other shotguns that have basically the same trigger group arrangement, the same trigger group mechanism. Sure, it was centered then, but moving it to one side doesn't really make it any more complicated to understand. And besides that, this is just like an Auto 5's carrier tail. It just runs in a T-track and pushes on the bolt group like that. We cock our hammer down, get it out of the way. We can see, right, how this rides there, how this bolt group rides on top of the hammer. It's all stuff we've seen before. There's really nothing too impossible to understand there. And I want that to be a take-home point about the Cosmi. It was designed in 1926. It's not like they had figured out caseless ammunition or G11 rotating bolt clockwork mechanism, right? This gun isn't anything like that. It's really pretty simple. It's easy to understand. It's inspired by designs that were easy to understand. There's nothing here mechanically that's like, oh no, how does that work? It's almost impossible to understand. I need an animation to have a chance. It's really not that complicated of a shotgun. And it's this deceptive simplicity that I think makes me even more interested in the thing, where it looks very complicated, right? Breaking open your semi-auto in front of your buddies at the range or on a hunting trip or something, it's going to make everybody want to ask questions about, well, why is your gun so darn weird? Why does it work that way? What's all these pieces do? And it's sort of like a tourist trap of a gun in that regard, where once it's broken open, everybody really wants to know, but it's really not that complicated. And this lack of complication also gives it the benefit of being reliable, because it doesn't have a ton of little fiddly parts that if they get slightly bent or tweaked or worn, the gun isn't going to work. Everything's pretty darn well built. All of the steel parts in the gun are polished and heat treated and done up well, right? Like really the only part of the gun that I sit there and go, I would worry about that breaking is the tiny little nose that makes up the disconnector surface there for the hammer. But unlike the Auto 5, right, there is no trigger slap in this mechanism. They've sort of solved that problem of the Auto 5 in how the trigger group all fits together. You're not going to have that trigger slap. The sear surfaces on the sear and the hammer aren't going to get beat up in their regular course of cycling. It's really solved that problem, and you don't have to worry about it. Even if you did have to remake some of these parts, they're not terribly complicated. Sure, there's a lot of shapes on them, and it would involve probably some grinder work. I imagine these involved some grinder work back in the day, just to get them to their perfect shape so that they all fit together correctly. But it's not like this is an impossible to make part, right? It's not like you're having to make a new barrel extension or a new bolt. Those parts are resilient enough. I couldn't ever imagine them breaking. And sort of one of this gun's claims to fame, its claim to quality, is that there's not a single cast or stamped part on this gun. Even these pieces, like this arm on the trigger, would be very easy to make out of a stamping. But the gun doesn't utilize stampings. It's all made from forgings or from billets. There's a couple videos that sort of go through the Cosmi factory and sort of look at and talk about the steels they use. It's all very deliberately chosen steels. It's all heat treated in a very deliberate way to make a gun that lasts a very long time. There's individual testaments and stories you can find about a Cosmi doing 100,000 rounds without a part breakage, or there's multiple Cosmis that have done it, or one guy's got a Cosmi that's done 250,000. I have no idea about the validity of these, but before I had the gun in my hand, my suspicion was there's no way that's true. After I got one in my hand, looking at the way all of the parts are designed and fit together, I think I could believe it. I think I'd be willing to believe that maybe springs would need to be replaced along the way, right? Because springs do wear out, but all of the internal metal parts of the gun have very positive engagement. They're all sized such that they're not going to be at risk of breaking, and all of them are incredibly hard. You can tell in the case of this gun that it's been shot quite a lot, right? It's got finish rubbed off in some areas. It's certainly a gun that's been used. But then sitting there, I was looking with a jeweler's inspection tool, looking there on the sear surfaces, they're still sharp enough, I bet you could cut yourself on them. And that's just really impressive to have in a shotgun. And that's, whenever you're buying a Cosmi, a lot of people ask, what could make a shotgun worth that much money? Well, it's the weight reduction cuts that they cover the gun in. It's the fact that the gun can be set up such that it is, and it's still relatively lightweight, and it balances so well. It's because a lot of shapes have to be put on these metal parts that don't really lend themselves to being mass manufactured, right? Sure, you could mim these parts, but then they're going to be breaking constantly. You could have a Cosmi that costs like $2,000 to $3,000, but it's going to be breaking constantly. In order to have the gun be as trim and svelte and point as nice as it does and balance as nice as it does, there has to be a lot of complexity and a lot of handwork put into the mechanism of the gun itself. And that's sort of where the cost of the Cosmi comes from, is they're using high-grade steels and they're using manufacturing processes that aren't fast or easy, which means that they're going to be expensive. But with all that discussed and everything we've sort of shown off here, I hope you guys can at least appreciate better why a Cosmi is an expensive gun. And then hopefully after our shooting section and then our conclusion sections, you might be able to understand maybe whether or not a Cosmi is right for you. Because there's certainly some people that don't shoot shotguns enough or don't want something out of a shotgun such that a Cosmi wouldn't make them happy. But I can tell you that the silly thing, you can probably tell right by my inflection and my tone throughout the whole video, the silly thing does make me pretty happy. One final thing to touch on here, just because I think I neglected to note it until now, is that there's 2 screws, a lock screw and a main screw. After the stock is off, after the trigger guard is off, that's how the trigger comes out of the gun, is this plate is sort of held in there on a dovetail on one side, so you remove the screws and then sort of lever it out, and that's how you get the trigger out of the gun. And then I guess last other part here before you'd have effectively a stripped receiver is 1 screw comes out there to get you this bolt release, this bolt latch and carrier latch out of the gun. The receiver latch here takes apart like we're used to seeing on regular over-unders or side-by-sides. And I'll have to see if I can get a picture of this safety mechanism, because it's sort of an interesting series of wires where moving it into position blocks the trigger, but it sort of has an armature down to there, which for automatics is really weird and complicated, but for side-by-sides and over-unders, they're sort of used to having the safety mechanism interact with the hammers and trigger group in a little funky ways, right? There's a little bit of articulation that's required in order to get the pieces that are moving to where they need to be. And with that said, I think we've pretty much discussed every piece of the Cosmi, at least so far as taking it apart. When you see the gun advertised, they will say that there are no screws in the gun's assembly. I think this is a mistranslation of something from Italian. There are quite a few screws in the gun, right? Screws to get the trigger group off, screws to get that off. The springs inside the bolt group are held in with screws. There's screws there, there's screws there. There are screws in the gun's assembly. I think what that translation is meant to be saying is that there's no screws required in the gun's disassembly. And what they mean by that is that you don't need a screwdriver to take the sling swivel off, to take the handguard off, to take the upper receiver off. And I guess maybe you don't need a screwdriver to get this off. I mean, it's got threads on it and it's probably technically a screw, but you can get the bolt group out of the gun and really get the gun disassembled this far, and the closest you come to needing a tool is this. So best I can figure, that's a little bit of a rough mistranslation where there are screws in the gun's assembly, but getting the gun disassembled for cleaning, you wouldn't ever really need a screwdriver. So take the whole no screws in assembly thing with a grain of salt. That's not actually like 100% true insofar as the way it gets translated. But with that all said, we're ready to start putting the silly thing back together. We'll start with the lower receiver because it's really just sticking the mag spring in and then sticking the Goblin's nadir back into it. And then we'll get the upper back together, put the whole thing back together, and then we're going to go shoot it. And that's a real treat. Okay, and so now to reinstall the internal gubbins, we've got the mag spring and the follower located down inside of the gubbins. And then all we really need to do is push the button here again and then set everything down into the gun, and it will sort of click firmly into place. Of course, you need to remember to have your sort of action bar, your connector there. You can give it a push here to make sure it's pushing against the spring. Push your follower, make sure it's not binding up. Cock your hammer, and then pull the trigger just to make sure everything there moves correctly. But then once you've got that, you've got a reassembled lower receiver. Cock the hammer for now. Set that to the side. Now we are ready to reassemble the bolt group. First thing that gets stuffed back in there is the bolt. We'll have to push over this little spring-loaded latch. It's really just so that the barrel can interact with the carrier there. So we'll push that out of the way. Then we push down the latch on top of the bolt group to get the bolt group to sink in. And there it goes. And at this point we can pull the spoon down, just latch it to the backwards position. It's a good spot for it for now. We can then take our recoil spring assembly, set it down over. Remember, the first few coils we're going to have to turn past the stud, and at that point it can be pushed down onto there. We will pay close attention to where the slit is in the friction piece, because we will now have to compress this and then rotate it. And you can try doing this aimed down at a table, but I'm just going to aim against the wall, so if it goes somewhere it's going to just stab into the drywall. We'll pull it back against our chest, get it back, and rotate it over. It's not a very light spring that's in there, and they've got springs that are even heavier than this, if you can believe it, for even heavier loads. This spring is about right for 2 3/4 and 3 dram loads, but they've got one sort of for the 4 dram 4.5 gram, like extra heavy hunting load springs as well. This is sort of the middle of the road spring. They've also got one for like little pipsqueak loads. Now with the spring reinstalled, we were able to take our barrel and carefully guide it first into the upper, and then next onto the end of the rod here, and then finally into the receiver. The barrel will not be able to sink all the way into the receiver because this nut actually puts a little bit of preload on the spring. So at this point we can take the buffer, stuff it all the way in there. Finally we can take the nut and then put it on to begin compressing not just the buffer spring, but the barrel spring, and then pulling the barrel into its final position in the upper. I've already put a little bit of grease on the flat part of this nut where it rotates against the spring just to sort of keep it from dragging. I don't know that that's necessary. The manual doesn't say to do that, but it seems to make it so that the nut spins a little bit easier. All right, I took everything into my lap there off camera just to make sure that I got everything lined up right and didn't scratch the barrel. But we can see that the nut will end up coming perfectly flush with the end of the guide rod, and that's how we know that everything there is correctly installed. At this point, the barrel, I guess the hood on the barrel extension should also be flush with the front of the upper. We can take our bolt, lock it back into the barrel, and then we will put our upper on our lower and then put the handguard back on, and then we're ready to go shoot the thing. This process is, like with typical over-unders, best done with sufficient caution. I'll try showing it to the camera without dinging anything up. There we go. There's a lug in the lower that the upper sits into. Snap things together there. Then we can rotate this around, get our forend iron. I guess I can show that to the camera. Installing the forend, you'll take the like with an over-under, right? You'll take the forend iron and stick it into that slot and then rotate it up onto the gun to avoid dinging anything up. I'll take it like so. Rotate it around, and it should just sit down nice. At this point, we will thread our screw back into that center steel rod, and after a couple of turns, we'll feel the detent start to click, 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 click. And there we go, and that's the final position. It won't go over to that next detent. So right here is where we want to be, and again, it's it's clocked. They clock the threads to the detent ratchets. It's just kind of hilarious how much attention to detail can be put into a gun. But then at that point, we have our reassembled Cosmi. We are now ready to go and shoot it. We'll do our shooting sections, and then we'll come back here for some final thoughts and analysis on the Cosmi semi-auto. This is the Cosmi semi-automatic shotgun. It's everyone's favorite break-action, long recoil semi-auto. As we've explained, it's really not that complicated on the inside, but you look, you feast your eyes on a mechanism like that and go, I am not worthy. Mankind didn't make this. It was invented by the aliens. At least that's how I feel. It's a really, really magnificent looking mechanism. And today we're going to have the pleasure of shooting some clays with it. Of course, these are relatively close range clays, and this thing is choked full. So we're going to have a little bit of difficulty hitting with as close as these things are, but I do want to show off just sort of how the thing works from a manual of arms perspective, as well as talk about maybe how it handles. I can tell you right off the bat, the thing balances so incredibly well. It's almost, it's almost difficult to describe. Anytime that you start describing how well it balances, you're just going to get accused of wine cork sniffery. And I think the only way to cure that is to hold one, especially hold one side by side with an Auto 5, because there just isn't a comparison. However, we'll also be comparing today against the Recoil. The Auto 5 is kind of the undisputed king of how soft shooting a 12-gauge shotgun can get once its friction system is set up right. And as we saw, while the Cosmi does have a friction system, it kind of works a little differently than the Auto 5s. That system's not quite there for the same thing the Auto 5 system is for because of how the handguard mechanism is set up on the Cosmi. Now, as we've already covered, loading the Cosmi is a little bit strange. You'll have to pull the bolt back manually to get one round plunked into the chamber. You'll have to cock the hammer if it hasn't already been cocked, so if it was dry fired after the bolt was last closed, you will need to do that. But then we load shells, one at a time, by pushing them backwards into the stock. With the gun loaded, we then hinge it shut, and it's ready to fire. There is a tang safety on the gun, which you could use, I guess, if you want to. I think that's more there for maybe regulations and certain sort of shooting competitions, because otherwise the way to make the gun safe is
like it's an over-under. Of course, over-unders still have safeties, but it's really just there, I guess, as a convenience. It's not in a very ergonomic spot. It's difficult to get to with where the latch lever is. But with the gun loaded up, we'll see if we can't break a couple of clays with the thing. Ah, I shot ahead of it. Ah, I shot ahead of it. So there we go. Now we've got the gun empty. Once you have a Cosmi empty, there's two ways that you can sort of remedy that situation. You can just plunk one round into the chamber, close the bolt, and then fire it again. The gun will, of course, then lock open. However, if what you want to do is get to the magazine, you can plunk that one round in the chamber, hinge the gun open, and then the magazine is once again all yours to stuff. It certainly takes a little bit of getting used to, but then once you're used to it, it's not terribly slow. It's certainly not as fast as, say an autoloader, especially a Browning with the speed load. It's never going to be that fast. But what it is faster than is your typical like over, under, or side by side. And that's really what this gun was meant to emulate, is all of the wonderful balance and handling characteristics of specifically a side by side, but in the function and the benefits, combining the benefits of that side by side with the benefits of the long recoil with the semi-automatic action. And I think the gun does a perfect job of that. And of course, we have to bear in mind as we're talking about this, that this gun came from a time where external hammer side-by-sides were a common thing. And so the manual arms of having to cock the hammer manually wasn't foreign to the designers of this gun. It wasn't foreign to the intended clientele of this gun. And the rest of the gun is just so good that even with it being antiquated in the same way external hammer guns are, it still just works so darn well. Shot in front of that one. Oh, we still got one round. We'll try this round from the hip. The thing is just a natural extension of your body. I don't know how to temper people's expectations. You talk about this gun without glazing it, but man, it's just something special. Now, when we talk in terms of recoil feel, that's really the biggest way I would say that the Cosmi differs from the Auto 5. Primarily what this is because the barrel spring is so much heavier than an Auto 5 and the friction rings aren't doing quite as much. The gun is very smooth in recoil, but counter recoil has the barrel moving forward at such a rate that the gun sort of slumps out of your shoulder. This gives the perception of lighter recoil than the gun actually has, but it takes just a little bit of getting used to the gun lurching away from you. And frankly, I think it's a lot like the Browning double auto in that regard because, again, that very stiff spring with a not quite as effective recoil system or friction system really has the same sort of feel as the barrel goes thunk, slamming back forwards. With that said, let's load the gun up, shoot a couple more shells, and then we'll head back inside, maybe after a little bit of slow-mo with the thing because it is kind of a good-looking gun, in case you guys haven't noticed. It's behind it. Well, that's the Cosmi. Well, I'm sure in other videos we'll end up having it back on. We'll compare it to a lot of other guns, but once you've seen it shoot once, it's kind of, you've seen it shoot 100 times. It points so naturally, it swings so nicely. The gun really is a mechanical work of art. We're going to head back inside and we're going to sit back at the table and sort of discuss how does this actually compare against an Auto 5 if you are a consumer interested in buying one or the other. And I think that discussion will be something you guys want to hang on to, because as many positive things as I said about this gun this far, we'll start pumping the brakes in our final thoughts and conclusions. But until then, that's been the Cosmi, and there's no brakes to pump. The thing is just awesome.
And there we have it. That's the Cosmi. Of course, as I mentioned, I bought this one used. They can be much more affordable used, but once I got the thing into my hands, right, I was taken in by the whole mechanisms and all of the way the gun fits together and it works in the manual of arms. But I pretty quickly understood that, and then got the gun taken apart and understood, like, oh, this is actually a pretty simple mechanism underneath all of the incredible appeal, right? It all looks very interesting, but it all works in a pretty simple, easy to understand way. And so after that, it was really just down to how the gun shot. Like with any shotgun, it took me a time to learn how the gun patterns and then figure out where my holds would need to be and how the thing works. And then past that point, the thing just shoots really well for me. I'm not going to do the thing where I say, oh, go buy an expensive gun, it'll make you a better shooter, because I really don't think that's the case here. However, this gun just fits me really well, and it swings really well, and it balances well for me, and with the length of pull sort of corrected, it's just a really good fit to my person, and the gun works great. Even after I wasn't so enchanted with the whole way the mechanism works and the quirkiness of loading the thing, the way the gun shoots just continues to impress me. It really does feel, right, if you ever had an Auto 5, right, as great as the Auto 5 is and as much as I eulogize it, there is no denying that any double gun, be it a side-by-side or an over-under, you can get something that's more trim and it's better balanced and it swings just a little bit nicer than you can get an Auto 5 to do. And then I held a Cosmi, and then I realized you can get an Auto 5 to do it, you just have to put the magazine back here and then sort of change the whole way the gun works and then make it hinge open for bonus style points, I guess. The Cosmi does point and swing and handle as nice as any of those, really nice handling double guns. And so it's really nice that you have most or maybe even all of the other benefits of a semi-auto, but in a gun that, if you closed your eyes and sort of felt it, you'd say, well, this is an over-under or this is a side-by-side. And that's kind of a cool thing to be able to do. A couple more closing thoughts. Of course, I will have more videos on the thing. I'll have to have more videos on the thing. I want to compare it to cheap shotguns side by side just to sort of show off what the difference is, as well as just showcase shooting the thing more, because as cool as these guns are, there's not a lot of footage. In fact, as far as I'm aware, this is the first video of taking one apart that I've ever seen, as far as getting the gubbins out of it completely. I'd like to be able to showcase more content on the gun, because I really do think the gun is pretty darn incredible. So, all that to say, if this video left you wanting more, there will be more, and you can do in the Patreon, and I guess either get early access to it or help influence me to make more videos about the Cosmi more often. You could do that there if you'd go and support me in the Patreon, that'd be cool. The next closing thought is one that I mentioned earlier on in the video, and it's, is a Cosmi worth what they cost? So again, we have to begin that discussion with, well, they cost a lot new, but not quite as much used, and you can find them used on Gunbroker or Rock Island or other places. And so ultimately that question gets answered by how much value you place in, it's not necessarily intangible quality, right? Because I would categorize wood in intangible quality. The wood on this gun, and the wood on Cosmis in general, is beautiful figured walnut, right? I've never seen a Cosmi with a stock that was like, that's hideous. However, for some people, what the stock looks like doesn't matter, because they're not interested in looking at the gun, they're interested in shooting the gun. So the Cosmi does have quite a bit of value tied up in that sort of intangible quality. However, it still has most of its value in tangible quality. The way that the parts are fit together and polished might not seem important, but after they're fit together and polished from select steels that are then heat treated, such that even after the undoubtedly thousands, if not tens of thousands of rounds that this gun has had put through it, the sear surfaces are still knife-like sharp. That sort of quality might not seem tangible, but I end up considering it tangible quality because that means parts aren't going to be breaking and parts aren't going to need maintenance, and the gun isn't going to need as much maintenance. And you won't have to be figuring out, well, does this part need ground on, or this part need filed or stoned or rounded off or made sharper or heat treated differently. You don't have to do a lot of that here. Even with Cosmis that are older, they have had this quality for a long time, and they have maintained this quality ever since. And so there's a lot of tangible quality that you're getting in a Cosmi that's not something that you would always feel. However, right, if we're to be realistic about it, if a Cosmi costs $25,000, does it shoot $24,000 better than like a nice Auto 5 with its friction system set up just right? As we explained in the shooting segment, it's not going to shoot as smooth as a very smooth Auto 5. It's just not going to happen. Of the Cosmis I've shot, of which there's been 6, all 6 of them, when fired for the loads that the springs were set up for, were smoother than just sort of your bog grade worn out Auto 5. But your Auto 5 where the friction parts are set up just right and there's the perfect amount of lubrication for the gun just to cycle, I've not been able to see or handle a Cosmi or get this Cosmi, and Lord knows I've tried. I have not been able to get this gun to cycle quite that smooth. It's close, and I don't want you to hear that the Cosmi isn't smooth, because it is. It's certainly smoother than a gas gun or an inertia gun, but it's not that silky smooth, like slow cycling that you can get out of an Auto 5 with perfectly adjusted friction components. The Cosmi can't quite get there, at least not without a complete redesign of its friction system, which I may end up doing one day anyway, just to sort of chase the dragon of Auto 5 smoothness in every gun that I pick up. But the other shooting characteristics of the Cosmi, the way it balances, the way it points, I've never had an Auto 5, and I've had Auto 5s with adjustable stocks, right, that I could set up just the way that the gun fits me. They still didn't swing as nice, they still didn't point as nice. And that amount of quality is worth exactly what you're willing to place in it. At $25,000, you know, I think that $24,000 delta between a nice Auto 5 and a brand new Cosmi is worth it. No, probably not. A lot of what you're paying for there depends on how much value you put in the intangible, right? The fact that no Auto 5 has ever looked this good. And that's just the way that it is, right? They've never had such beautiful wood. They've never had such interesting, intricate, weight-reduced geometry going on inside of them. It's just not the way that Auto 5s are made. However, whenever you start looking at used Cosmis, they're at the less than $10,000 range. I think the argument keeps getting closer and closer to being realistic. Is the 9 times surplusage compared to a good Auto 5 there worth it? I think, in my opinion, for how well this gun fits me, the answer is yes. This gun fits me well enough, and it shoots well enough, and it makes me happy enough, and the mechanism is interesting enough that if you offered me the opportunity to buy this gun, or maybe a duplicate of this gun at $10,000, I'd say yes. I'd be inclined to say yes. I'd be interested in trading guns or selling guns to be able to say yes. For $10,000, I would want another one just like this. And I don't say these sort of things lightly, because usually I'm pretty darn miserly about how I want to spend money on guns. If you've ever seen FUD blasters, I'm sure you're familiar with my opinion that every 223 rifle should just cost $500. Like a G36 shouldn't cost more than $500. That's typically my opinion on those things, because I can't appreciate, I can't find any quality, tangible or intangible, in the G36 that makes me go, wow, this is worth $5,000. But with the Cosmi, it's readily apparent to me. And maybe that's just because I'm flood-pilled to some extent, and I see the oil-finished wood and I go, oh, doesn't that look nice? And I see the mechanism and I start checking things on the mechanism and inspecting how sharp these surfaces are even after so many rounds and going, oh yes, this was made very well. But I think even beyond checking those things, just the way the Cosmi looks is it has that curb appeal where you look at it and go, there's something weird about that gun. And you see it firing semi-auto, or you see it broken open and then closed and fired semi-auto, and it just makes your brain go, wow, I need to know more about that, and I need to own one of those. This shotgun represents the combination of best made, best handling, best pointed, best fit to me, most interesting, such that it's sort of the Goldilocks thing for me, and I think for other people too, because despite how expensive these guns are, at new prices they've sold 9,000, almost 10,000 of them. And they've stayed in production now for almost 100 years, right? Coming up here in a year or two, it'll be 100 years that the Cosmi has been around. And while a common criticism of the Cosmi is, well, if it's so good, why didn't anybody ever copy the way it did anything? Well, spoiler alert, maybe they did, maybe there are, and maybe we'll look at those later. But I think the better rebuttal to that is, no shotgun stays in production 100 years unless it's really good, right? Virtually unchanged. Like, they've changed some cuts, right? There's like different cuts and different lightning that's been done on the gun throughout the years, but mechanically the way the gun works, the manual of arms, hasn't changed since the gun was designed back in 1926. And that's incredibly impressive in my opinion, right? A gun does not stay in production for 100 years, virtually unchanged, unless it's really good. Unless it sort of occupies a niche where not only is it mechanically interesting and it's good because this is the way we used to do it, but it's just objectively good at doing the thing that it was meant to do. So if your favorite shotgun thing is sporting clays or hunting or trap or skeet, the Cosmi can really do all of that. And sure, with this example being choked full and with a short barrel, it's a little bit of an odd duck. But the thought that I really want to leave you guys with is that even for me, who's somebody who's usually very miserly with guns, at the price that used Cosmis can go for, sort of this maybe $7,000 to $10,000 range, maybe $5,000 on the low end if you've ever found one that's maybe a little rough around the edges, the combination of tangible and intangible quality together in the thing will make somebody as miserly as me go, yep, I want it, that's great. And so if you ever get the opportunity to shoot a Cosmi, I think you should, jump at the opportunity to take it, right? Especially if you can do it without paying for it, just to see if that's the sort of thing you like. For me, it was sort of love at first sight. I always knew I wanted one. I got one, and usually when I've had these sort of relationships with guns, they have let me down consistently. The Cosmi is maybe one of the few times where it was only the ever so slightest letdown because I couldn't get the thing to shoot quite as smooth as the smoothest of Auto 5s, but everything else taken in consideration, this is a better shooting, better handling gun than even my best Auto 5s. And I want the takeaway to be that factoring in tangible and intangible, or even just looking at that tangible quality, better gun than the Auto 5. Whether or not the price is commensurate with that difference really comes down to what you think and what your preferences are. But at least in my case, I didn't think I would be able to say this, but yeah, I think the Cosmi is about that good. If you guys have liked this video, if you guys like videos like this, again, you can support me on Patreon. You can go and find the link there in the description. We'll have more videos with Cosmis and other long recoil shotguns, but I'm very, very happy to sort of show you guys what's effectively the crown jewel of long recoil shotguns here today, which is an overview of the Cosmi. Maybe we'll take more in-depth looks at it later. We'll go and shoot different targets with it later. I'd maybe even like to take it hunting at some point and then maybe make some sort of footage or content based off of that. But this is the Cosmi. I like it a lot. I can't stop gushing about it, and I'm going to be accused of being a wine cork sniffer, but I'll take that because I really do think the gun is about that good.